Hey there! Tonight we journey into the shadows of the oldest written stories humanity has ever left behind. We're talking about clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks, tablets that have survived beneath the desert sand for over 4,000 years, waiting to tell us something profound about how ancient people understood their existence, their purpose, and the cosmic structures that bound them. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy deep dives into ancient history, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I always find it fascinating to know who's joining us on these journeys through time. Now, settle in. Maybe dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft ambient sound. Tonight we're examining what the Sumerians really wrote about creation, servitude, death, and the realm they called Ker, a place that scholars have compared to a cosmic prison from which no soul could escape. We'll separate the authentic ancient voices from the modern myths that have grown around them. Myths about planets named Nibiru and alien gods who supposedly enslaved humanity. We'll look at what the tablets actually say, what they meant to the people who wrote them, and why these stories still echo through our understanding of existence itself. The story begins in southern Mesopotamia, in the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. This is where civilization, as we understand the concept, first emerged from scattered villages and nomadic groups into something recognizable as cities, governments, and written language. The Sumerians appeared in this region around 4,500 years before the Common Era, maybe earlier, depending on how you define their emergence as a distinct culture. They built cities with names that still carry weight in archaeological circles: Uruk, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash. These weren't small settlements. Uruk at its height housed perhaps 50,000 people, an enormous population for the ancient world, all living within walls that protected them from raiders and rival city-states. But what makes the Sumerians truly extraordinary? What elevates them beyond being just another ancient culture lost to time is that they invented writing. Not the kind of pictographs you find in Egypt or the knotted strings of the Inca, but actual writing. A system where symbols could represent not just objects but sounds, ideas, abstract concepts. They called this cuneiform, meaning wedge-shaped, because scribes pressed reed styluses into soft clay tablets at specific angles to create the characters. Each press left a wedge-shaped mark, and combinations of these marks could express anything from inventory lists of barley to epic poems about the creation of the universe. These tablets, tens of thousands of them, have been recovered from ancient Mesopotamian sites. They were baked hard by fires that destroyed the cities, ironically preserving them for millennia. Archaeologists have been deciphering them since the 19th century, slowly piecing together the language, the grammar, the meanings. What emerged from this patient scholarly work was something remarkable. The oldest literature in human history, stories that predated the Bible, the Iliad, everything we thought of as ancient. Among these stories were creation myths, flood narratives, tales of gods and heroes, and descriptions of the afterlife. These tablets contained the Sumerian understanding of reality itself. The most important thing to understand before we go further is this: what the Sumerians actually wrote and what modern pseudo-archaeologists claim they wrote are two entirely different things. This distinction matters because in recent decades, a parallel mythology has grown up around Sumerian texts, one that has nothing to do with legitimate scholarship and everything to do with ancient astronaut theories, conspiracy narratives, and misunderstood translations. The name most associated with this misinterpretation is Zecharia Sitchin, who published a series of books starting in 1976, claiming that Sumerian tablets described extraterrestrial beings called the Anunnaki, who came to Earth from a planet called Nibiru to mine gold, and who created humanity as a slave species through genetic engineering. Sitchin's work has been comprehensively debunked by every credentialed Sumerologist and Assyriologist who has examined his claims. Scholars like Michael Heiser spent years documenting Sitchin's errors, showing that he mistranslated words, invented meanings that don't exist in Sumerian dictionaries compiled by the ancient Mesopotamians themselves, and cherry-picked passages while ignoring context. The cylinder seal that Sitchin claimed showed a diagram of the solar system with 12 planets. It doesn't. The sun symbol he pointed to isn't even the Sumerian sun symbol, which appears on hundreds of other artifacts and looks completely different. The word Nibiru, which Sitchin claimed referred to a hidden planet. In actual Sumerian and Akkadian astronomical texts, it refers to Jupiter, or sometimes Mercury or a star, or a specific point in the sky, never a planet beyond Pluto. The ancient astronomers themselves left us their god-to-planet matchups in bilingual dictionaries, and Sitchin's interpretations don't match what they actually wrote. This matters because tonight we're going to explore what the Sumerians genuinely believed about cosmic structure, human purpose, and the afterlife, and these authentic beliefs are strange and profound enough without inventing aliens. The real Sumerian cosmos was structured as a prison of sorts, but not in the way pop culture would have you believe. It was a cosmos where humans were created explicitly to serve gods, where the dead descended into an underworld from which there was no return, where the boundaries between earth, heaven, and the realm beneath were carefully maintained, and where mortals existed in a state of permanent obligation to divine powers who demanded constant worship and sacrifice. This was their actual worldview, preserved in their own words on clay tablets that we can read today, and it's far more interesting than any ancient astronaut fantasy. Part 1. The Sumerian Cosmos Structure of Reality. To understand how the Sumerians viewed reality, we need to start with their cosmology, the way they conceptualized the structure of the universe. Unlike modern cosmology with its expanding universe and billions of galaxies, the Sumerian cosmos was intimate, bounded, and hierarchical. It consisted of three primary realms stacked vertically: An, the heaven above, Ki, the earth in the middle, and Kur, the underworld below. These weren't just physical locations, they were domains of power, each ruled by specific gods, each with its own laws and inhabitants. Heaven, An, was the realm of the sky god, whose name was literally the Sumerian word for heaven. This was where the most powerful deities dwelt, looking down upon the earth and the affairs of mortals. The stars were visible gods, the planets were wandering deities with their own personalities and influences. The Sumerians were sophisticated astronomers who tracked celestial movements, calculated lunar cycles, and understood planetary positions well enough to create agricultural calendars. They associated specific gods with specific planets: Inanna with Venus, Nanna with the moon, Utu with the sun. But they did not believe there were 12 planets. Extant astronomical tablets, hundreds of them, consistently reference only 7 celestial bodies: the sun, moon, and 5 visible planets. This is not speculation or interpretation. We have their star charts, their astronomical tablets, their observation records. Between heaven and earth was the atmosphere, the domain of Enlil, whose name means Lord Wind or Lord Air. Enlil was perhaps the most important god in the early Sumerian pantheon, more powerful in practice than the sky god. Enlil was the one who separated heaven from earth in the beginning, who maintained the boundary between the realms, who enforced the order of creation. His city was Nippur, considered the religious capital of Sumer long before any political unification. The other gods deferred to Enlil. When major decisions needed to be made, the gods assembled at Enlil's temple in Nippur. He was, in many texts, described as the king of the gods, the one whose word was final. Earth. Ki was the disc-shaped realm of solid ground floating on the cosmic ocean. This was where humans lived, where cities rose and fell, where agriculture transformed the landscape. The earth was not seen as a prison initially, but as the human domain, the place where mortals could build, create, and worship. Rivers flowed across it, bringing life from the mountains down to the sea. The Sumerians understood that the Tigris and Euphrates came from somewhere beyond their territory, from highlands, the north and east, and they incorporated this geography into their myths. The fresh water that welled up from springs and rivers was considered separate from the salt water of the sea, and both were personified as divine entities with their own agency. Beneath the earth was the Abzu, the freshwater ocean that existed under the ground. This wasn't metaphorical. The Sumerians, like many ancient peoples, understood that water came from underground sources, and they imagined a vast ocean beneath the Earth's surface from which all springs and wells drew. The god Enki, also called Ea in later Akkadian texts, ruled over the Abzu. Enki was the god of wisdom, magic, craftsmanship, and all things involving water. His temple in Eridu, the oldest Sumerian city according to their own traditions, was believed to sit directly above the Abzu, giving Enki and his priests access to the deepest mysteries of existence. Enki was often portrayed as friendly to humanity, teaching them skills, warning them of dangers, interceding with the other gods on their behalf. And then, deeper still, below even the Abzu, was Kur. This is where we need to pay very close attention, because Kur is the closest thing in Sumerian cosmology to a cosmic prison, and it's entirely real in their belief system. No aliens required. Kur was the underworld, the land of the dead, the place from which no mortal could return. Its name meant land, foreign land, mountain, or underworld depending on context, but when used to describe the realm of the dead, it had a specific unchanging meaning: the place below, the house of darkness, the land of no return. The Sumerians wrote extensively about Kur, more extensively than they wrote about heaven in many ways, perhaps because death was more immediate and universal than divine splendor. We have multiple texts describing journeys to Kur, the structure of Kur, the rules of Kur, the gods who ruled there. The most famous is Inanna's descent to the underworld, where the goddess Inanna decides to visit her sister Ereshkigal, queen of Kur, and experiences what awaits all who enter that realm. The text describes 7 gates that one must pass through to enter Kur, and at each gate something is stripped away. Clothing, jewelry, symbols of power, all removed systematically until Inanna stands naked and powerless before the judges of the dead. This stripping away at the gates was not just a literary device. It represented the Sumerian understanding that death removes all earthly status, all achievement, all power. Rich and poor, king and commoner, warrior and scribe, all enter Kur equal, all reduced to the same shadowy existence. The Anunnaki, a group of 7 judges, sat in Kur and pronounced judgment on the dead. But this judgment wasn't about moral behavior. The Sumerians didn't have a concept of heaven and hell as reward and punishment. Kur wasn't a place of torture for the wicked or paradise for the righteous. It was simply where everyone went, good and bad alike, and the judgment of the Anunnaki determined one's place within that realm based on social status in life and the funeral rites performed after death. The geography of Kur was described in various texts with consistent details. It was located far to the east, beyond the mountains where the sun rose. You couldn't reach it by walking. You had to die, or in the case of rare heroes and gods, you had to know secret paths and magic words. The entrance was guarded by Neti, the gatekeeper, who decided who could pass. The realm itself was a vast city, dark and dusty, where the dead lived in a twilight existence. They wore feathers like birds, an image that appears repeatedly in Sumerian art and poetry. They ate dust and clay. They drank muddy water. Light never reached them. The sun god Utu travelled through Kur each night on his way from west to east for the sunrise, bringing brief illumination. But the dead themselves existed in permanent darkness. Ereshkigal, whose name meant Queen of the Great Earth or Lady of the Great Place, ruled this realm. She hadn't chosen this position. According to some myths, she was abducted and taken to Kur, forced to become its queen. Other texts suggest she was assigned the position when the cosmos was divided among the gods. Either way, she ruled with absolute authority over the dead. Her consort in later texts was Nergal, a god associated with war, plague, and the scorching heat of summer. Together they presided over a court of underworld deities, demons, and the shades of the dead. What made Kur prison-like wasn't torture or punishment in the Christian sense. It was permanence. The phrase "land of no return" appears again and again in Sumerian texts. Once you entered Kur, you could not leave. Your shade, your ghost, your essence, whatever remained of you after death, was bound there forever. You could be summoned through necromancy, briefly contacted by the living through rituals, but you yourself could not cross back through those 7 gates. Even gods who descended to Kur, like Inanna, required elaborate rescue operations to escape, and even then someone had to take their place. When Inanna returned from the underworld, she was accompanied by demons called Gala, who dragged her husband Dumuzi back to Kür as a substitute. The balance had to be maintained. Kür required its inhabitants. This permanence, this absolute boundary between the living and the dead, shaped Sumerian culture profoundly. Funerary rites were crucial because they determined one's status in Kür. Families were obligated to provide offerings to the dead, pouring water and laying out food at the grave, so that the deceased would have something to sustain them in that dusty realm. Neglected dead became dangerous, restless spirits who could return to plague the living. The Sumerians were terrified of dying without proper burial, of being forgotten, of having no one to make offerings. An entire category of demons, the Gala, existed specifically to drag neglected or improperly buried dead back to Kür, sometimes taking living people with them by mistake or malice. So when we talk about the Sumerian tablets describing a prison, Kür is the authentic answer. Not a planet, not an alien internment camp, but a cosmological structure built into the fabric of reality, a realm from which escape was impossible, where all humans were destined to end up regardless of their actions in life. The earth itself was free, but mortality was a sentence, and that sentence led inevitably downward to darkness and dust. The Sumerians knew this. They wrote about it constantly. Their literature is suffused with awareness of mortality, with the inevitability of death, with the futility of seeking immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which drew heavily on Sumerian traditions even though it was written in Akkadian, centers entirely on the realization that death cannot be escaped, that even heroes and kings must eventually descend to Kür. Part 2, Creation and Servitude, the Purpose of Humanity. But Kür wasn't the only way in which Sumerian cosmology resembled a prison system. The very creation of humanity, according to their myths, was an act of imposing servitude. Multiple Sumerian and later Babylonian texts describe why humans were created, and the answer is shockingly consistent. Humans exist to serve the gods, to relieve the gods of the burdens of maintaining creation. We aren't talking about metaphorical service or abstract worship. The texts are explicit. Humans were created to do physical labor, to tend the fields, to dig canals, to provide food and offerings so that the gods would not have to work. The earliest creation story we have comes from a tablet found at Nippur, dating to around 1600 years before the Common Era, though the story itself is certainly older, passed down orally for generations before being committed to writing. This is the Eridu Genesis, also called the Sumerian flood story or Sumerian creation myth. The tablet is badly damaged with many lines missing or illegible, but the basic narrative is clear enough. In the beginning there were only gods. They created the earth and heaven, separated them, established order. Then they created animals and finally humans. The purpose is stated plainly in the surviving fragments. Humans were created to cultivate the earth, to build cities, to serve the gods. But the fullest account comes from a later Akkadian text called the Atrahasis Epic, dating to around 1700 years before the Common Era. Akkadian was the Semitic language that succeeded Sumerian as the dominant language of Mesopotamia, but Akkadian scribes preserved Sumerian traditions and retold Sumerian myths in their own language. The Atrahasis is one of the most important sources we have for understanding Mesopotamian creation theology, and it's remarkably detailed about why humans were created. The Atrahasis begins with a time when only gods existed. These gods were divided into two groups, the Anunnaki, the senior gods who held power and made decisions, and the Igigi, the younger gods who did the actual work of maintaining creation. For 40 years, the text says, the Igigi gods worked. They dug canals to control the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They cleared land for agriculture. They built the infrastructure of civilization, and they hated it. The work was backbreaking, endless, and they saw no reason why they should bear this burden while the Anunnaki relaxed in luxury. So the Igigi revolted. They threw down their tools. They marched to the house of Enlil, the king of the gods, carrying torches and weapons. They surrounded his dwelling and demanded an end to their servitude. Enlil was furious. He considered destroying the rebels, wiping them out for their insolence. But Enki, the god of wisdom, intervened with a different solution. Instead of punishing the Igigi, why not create a new species to do the work? A species that could labor without complaint, that could maintain creation, that could serve the gods without having the power or knowledge to rebel. Humans. The goddess Nintu, also called Bele-Ili or Mami, depending on the text, was summoned. She was the womb goddess, the birth mother, the one with the knowledge to create life. But creating humans required something special, something that would make them capable of intelligence and work, but also subordinate and mortal. The solution was to mix clay from the earth with the blood of a slain god. We'ila, a minor deity, was selected for sacrifice. His blood was mixed with clay, and from this mixture humans were formed. The divine blood gave humans their intelligence and life force. The clay gave them their mortality and connection to the earth. 7 males and 7 females were created initially, and they were successful beyond expectation. Humans multiplied rapidly. They cleared land, dug canals, planted crops, built cities, and most importantly, they performed the rituals and provided the offerings that sustained the gods. The Igigi were relieved of their labor, free to enjoy existence while humans did the work. For a time, this arrangement satisfied everyone, but then a new problem emerged. Humans became too numerous and too noisy. The text is specific about this. The gods couldn't sleep because of the clamor of humanity, the constant noise of human activity, voices, celebrations, conflicts. Enlil, who required rest and order, became increasingly irritated. He sent plague to reduce the population. Enki, the friend of humanity, taught the people how to ward off the plague through prayers to specific gods. Enlil sent drought. Again, Enki intervened with solutions. Enlil sent famine, trying to starve humanity into quieter numbers. Each time, Enki found a way to help the humans survive. Finally, Enlil decided on a permanent solution, a great flood that would destroy all of humanity, silencing their noise forever. He convinced the other gods to swear an oath not to warn the humans, but Enki, bound by the oath not to tell humans directly, found a loophole. He went to the reed wall of a house owned by Atrahasis, a particularly wise and pious man, and spoke to the wall rather than to Atrahasis directly. "Reed wall," Enki said, "pay attention to my words. Flee the house, build a boat, forsake possessions, and save life." Atrahasis, listening behind the wall, understood. He built a boat, loaded it with animals and his family, and when the flood came, he survived. The flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights. The waters rose over the earth, drowning everything. The gods watching from heaven immediately regretted their decision because with all the humans dead, there was no one to provide offerings. The gods were starving, gathering around any remaining altar like flies, desperate for sacrifices that would never come. When the flood waters receded and Atrahasis emerged, offering burnt sacrifices to the gods, they rushed to the sweet savor like people dying of hunger. Enlil was furious that a human had survived, but the other gods, especially Enki, persuaded him that complete destruction had been a mistake. They needed humans, but they also needed to control human population so the noise wouldn't become overwhelming again. So Nintu, the birth goddess, established new conditions for human existence. Some women would be barren, some infants would die shortly after birth. Demons called the Pasitu would snatch babies from their mothers' laps. Death would claim people throughout life, not just in old age. Human lifespan, which had apparently been longer before, was shortened. These weren't punishments exactly. They were population control measures, ways to keep humanity numerous enough to serve the gods but limited enough not to disturb them. This is the Sumerian and Babylonian understanding of humanity's place in the cosmos. We were created to serve. We exist at the pleasure of beings more powerful than ourselves. Our suffering, our labor, our mortality, all of it is by design, built into our nature from the moment clay and divine blood were mixed together. The gods need us, but they also resent us. They gave us intelligence so we could perform complex tasks, but they gave us mortality so we would never threaten their supremacy. We're trapped in this arrangement. We can't refuse to serve because we're dependent on the gods for the very infrastructure of reality. Rain, sun, fertile soil, protection from chaos. and at the end of our service we descend to Kur, where we continue a shadow existence in service to Ereshkigal and the gods of the underworld. The Sumerian term for this relationship was Namlu, which translates roughly as humanity, but carries connotations of status and obligation. Humans were Namlu, and gods were Dingir. The two categories were absolutely distinct. No human could become a god. No god was obligated to treat humans as equals. Kings claimed to rule by divine mandate, serving as intermediaries between the human and divine realms, but even kings were mortal. Even kings descended to Kur. The Sumerian king list, a text that chronicles the rulers of Sumerian city-states, makes a stark distinction between the mythical kings who ruled before the flood, whose reigns lasted thousands of years, and the historical kings after the flood, whose reigns were measured in decades. The flood marked a change, a moment when divine power was deliberately reduced in the human population, when the immortality that some early humans possessed was revoked. So the tablets describe a cosmos where Earth is the middle realm, bounded above by heaven and below by Kur, where humans were created explicitly for servitude, and where death leads inevitably to an underworld from which there is no escape. This is the prison. Not a planet, not a physical structure, but an entire cosmological system designed to keep humans in their place, performing their function, unable to transcend the limitations built into their creation. The Sumerians weren't writing science fiction or encoding alien encounters. They were describing the world as they understood it, a world where divine power structured reality and humans existed within carefully maintained boundaries. Part 3. The tablets themselves, what we actually have. Let's talk about the physical objects we're discussing, because understanding the tablets themselves helps clarify why mistranslations and misinterpretations are so harmful. These aren't mysterious artifacts covered in indecipherable symbols. They're historical documents written in known languages that scholars have been studying for over a century and a half. Cuneiform was deciphered in the mid-1800s through painstaking work by linguists who compared Akkadian, Persian, and other languages, eventually cracking the code of both Akkadian and the earlier Sumerian. Today, there are comprehensive dictionaries, grammars, and lexicons for these languages. Universities teach courses in reading cuneiform. Thousands of tablets have been translated and published in academic journals. The tablets themselves are clay, usually about the size of a modern paperback book, though some are much larger and some much smaller. Scribes would wet clay, form it into a flat or slightly curved shape, and then use a reed stylus cut at an angle to press wedge-shaped marks into the surface. The angle and combination of these wedges created different signs. Sumerian cuneiform uses over 600 distinct signs, each representing syllables, whole words, or concepts. It's a complex system, but not an impossible one. Scribes trained for years in schools called tablet houses, where they copied standard texts, learned vocabulary lists, practiced mathematics and accounting. Being a scribe was a respected profession, often hereditary, requiring intelligence, memory, and precision. Most surviving tablets deal with mundane matters: economic records documenting grain deliveries, contracts for the sale of land, receipts for bronze tools, lists of workers assigned to specific projects. These economic texts vastly outnumber literary or religious tablets. Ancient Mesopotamia was a bureaucratic society that kept meticulous records. Every transaction, every temple offering, every assignment of labor, all of it was recorded on tablets and filed away in archives. When archaeologists excavate Sumerian sites, they often find entire rooms filled with these administrative tablets, sometimes thousands in a single structure. This documentary evidence has allowed historians to reconstruct Sumerian economy, labor systems, agriculture, and trade networks in remarkable detail. Literary tablets, the ones containing myths, epics, hymns, and prayers, are rarer but still substantial in number. These were often copied and recopied by scribes in training, which is how they survived. A popular text might be copied dozens or hundreds of times across different cities and different centuries, with minor variations as scribes adapted the language or updated references. The tablets containing the Anu Merlish, the Babylonian creation epic, have been found at multiple sites. The Atrahasis exists in several versions, including an Old Babylonian version from around 1700 years before the Common Era and later Neo-Assyrian copies. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the most famous Mesopotamian literary work, exists in Sumerian, Akkadian, and even Hittite versions, showing how widely it spread. When scholars translate these tablets, they're not guessing at meanings or inserting their own interpretations. They're using dictionaries compiled by the ancient Mesopotamians themselves. Yes, the Sumerians and Babylonians created bilingual dictionaries, lists that match Sumerian words with their Akkadian equivalents, along with explanations of usage and context. These lexical lists were teaching tools for scribes who needed to read older Sumerian texts, even after Akkadian became the dominant language. Modern scholars have published comprehensive dictionaries based on these ancient lexical lists, plus thousands of contextual uses across different tablets. The Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, for example, is a multi-volume work that documents every known use of Akkadian words, showing how meanings could shift in different contexts, but also demonstrating consistent core definitions. This matters enormously when evaluating claims about hidden meanings or alternative translations. When Zechariah Sitchin claims that the Sumerian word mu means spaceship, but every Sumerian dictionary and every contextual use of the word across thousands of tablets indicates it means name, we can confidently say he's wrong. This isn't interpretation or bias, it's evidence. When he claims the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from Nibiru, but Sumerian texts explicitly describe the Anunnaki as children of An and Ki, heaven and earth, who descend into the underworld to serve as judges of the dead, we can point to the actual tablets and show exactly what they say. The tablet that Sitchin most famously misrepresented is Cylinder Seal VA 243, held in the Vorderasiatische Museum in Berlin. Cylinder seals were small carved stone cylinders that, when rolled across wet clay, left an impression that served as a signature or mark of authentication. VA 243 shows a scene with various figures and symbols, including one figure that Sitchin identified as a representation of the solar system, with 12 planets arranged around a sun. This, he claimed, proved that the Sumerians knew about all the planets in our solar system plus an extra one, Nibiru. The problem is that the symbol Sitchin identified as the sun isn't the Sumerian sun symbol. The actual Sumerian sun symbol appears on hundreds of seals and monuments and looks completely different. A circle with 4 triangular points and wavy lines radiating outward, representing rays. The symbol on VA 243 is a star, shown with multiple points, which was a common way to depict stars or divine status. The dots around it aren't planets, they're other stars, part of a conventional astronomical or mythological scene. Moreover, when the inscription on the seal was actually translated by scholars who could read Sumerian, it turned out to say, "You're his servant," a message from a nobleman to a servant about social hierarchy, nothing to do with astronomy or creation myths. Dozens of Sumerian astronomical tablets have been published and translated. These tablets track the movements of celestial bodies, record lunar eclipses, document the positions of Venus over years of observation. They consistently reference the same 7 celestial bodies: the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These were the objects visible to the naked eye, the ones ancient astronomers could actually observe and track. The Sumerians called them Mul, meaning stars or celestial objects. They had names for each: Utu for the Sun, Nana for the Moon, Ninsiana for Venus, and so on. Later Babylonian astronomical texts, written in Akkadian, continued these traditions and became even more sophisticated, developing mathematical models to predict planetary positions. None of these texts mention outer planets like Uranus or Neptune, which can't be seen without telescopes, much less a hypothetical Nibiru with a 3,600-year orbit. What the tablets do extensively document is the underworld. If we're looking for Sumerian descriptions of prison-like structures, independent texts describing journeys to Kur, rules of Kur, the structure of Kur's 7 gates, the judges who preside there, the demons who inhabit it, the fate of souls who enter. The death of Ur-Nammu describes the Sumerian king's arrival in the underworld and the gifts he presents to the gods who rule there, showing that even in death, hierarchies and obligations continue. The descent of Inanna describes the process of entering the underworld in procedural detail, gate by gate, stripping by stripping, judgment by judgment. Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, a Sumerian poem that was later incorporated into the Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh, describes Enkidu's descent to the underworld and the rules he breaks that doom him to remain there permanently. These aren't vague metaphors or coded messages. They're direct descriptions written in clear language. The tablets describing Kür use specific architectural and geographical terms. They mention the 7 gates as Ka, the standard Sumerian word for gate. They describe the judges as Anuna sitting in judgment, using the same term for judge found in legal tablets. They use Kür not as a code word but as the actual Sumerian term for underworld, which also meant foreign land or mountain depending on context, just as English uses underworld to mean both the realm of the dead and criminal subcultures without confusion. We can read these tablets because the language is known. We can verify translations because we have multiple texts using the same words in similar contexts. We can check scholarly translations against each other because hundreds of academics working independently have translated the same tablets and reached consensus on meanings. This consensus isn't groupthink or conspiracy. It's the natural result of transparent methodology applied to clear evidence. When 10 different scholars translate the same Akkadian passage and all arrive at the same English meaning, it's because the Akkadian is unambiguous. The tablets also contain commentaries, which are texts where ancient scribes explained older texts, interpreted obscure passages, or provided context. These commentaries show us that even ancient readers sometimes found older texts confusing and needed explanations, but the explanations they provided were rooted in their language, their culture, their understanding. Modern scholars can read these ancient commentaries and see how Sumerian readers understood their own texts. This gives us an additional check on translation accuracy. If we translate a passage one way, but ancient commentaries suggest a different meaning, we adjust our understanding. It's rigorous, iterative scholarship. None of this complexity exists in pseudo-archaeological work like Sitchin's. There's no peer review, no checking of sources, no engagement with the actual evidence. Mistranslations are presented as discoveries. Cherry-picked passages are taken out of context. Entire bodies of contradicting evidence are ignored. The result is a fiction dressed up as scholarship, convincing to people who don't have the tools to check the claims, but immediately obvious as fraud to anyone who can actually read Sumerian or Akkadian. Part 4. The Anunnaki from divine judges to alien overlords. The biggest distortion in modern pseudo-archaeology involves the Anunnaki, a term that appears frequently in Sumerian and Akkadian texts, with a specific, consistent meaning that has been completely twisted in popular culture. Understanding who the Anunnaki actually were requires looking at how the term is used across many different tablets and contexts, not cherry-picking convenient passages. The word Anunnaki literally means offspring of An, or more loosely, princely offspring. An, remember, was the god of heaven, and Ki was the goddess of earth. The Anunnaki were their divine children, a group of gods who played various roles in Sumerian mythology. In the earliest texts, the Anunnaki are depicted as a collective assembly of deities who make decisions about fate and destiny, who decree laws, who judge disputes among gods and between gods and humans. They're not a separate race of beings. They're gods, children of the primordial couple, part of the standard Sumerian pantheon. As Sumerian religion evolved and merged with Akkadian traditions, the role of the Anunnaki became more specifically associated with the underworld. By the time we get to Akkadian versions of myths, the Anunnaki are predominantly described as judges of the dead, 7 gods who sit in Kür and determine the fate of souls who arrive there. This association is consistent across multiple texts. In Inanna's descent, the Anunnaki judges condemn Inanna to death when she enters their realm. In the death of Ur-Nammu, the king presents gifts to various underworld gods, including the Anunnaki judges. In Nergal and Ereshkigal, a myth about how Nergal became ruler of the underworld, the Anunnaki serve Ereshkigal and help her maintain order in Kur. At no point in any authentic Sumerian or Akkadian text are the Anunnaki described as extraterrestrials. At no point are they said to come from another planet. At no point do they mine gold or create humans through genetic engineering or any other science fiction scenario. These ideas were invented in the 20th century, primarily by Sitchin, who took the term Anunnaki, stripped away its actual context, and filled it with science fiction content. The confusion partly stems from legitimate complexity in Sumerian theology. Different cities had different patron gods, and the relationships between gods could vary depending on which city's traditions you were reading. Enlil was supreme in Nippur, but Enki was supreme in Eridu, and Inanna Ishtar was supreme in Uruk. This doesn't mean there were contradictions, or that scholars can't understand Sumerian religion. It means the religion was pluralistic, with local variations and ongoing theological development. The Anunnaki could be described as great gods in one text, judges of the underworld in another, and a general assembly of deities in a third because their role shifted over time and varied by context. What's crucial is that in every authentic context, they're gods. Divine beings, yes, but gods in the standard ancient Near Eastern sense. Powerful entities controlling aspects of reality, demanding worship, engaging in politics and conflicts with each other, immortal but not omnipotent, capable of making mistakes, subject to fate and destiny like everything else in the Sumerian cosmos. They're not visitors from space. They didn't arrive in spaceships. They didn't set up gold mining operations. These narratives have no basis in any Sumerian tablet. The claim that the Anunnaki created humans comes from a misreading of the creation myths we discussed earlier. Yes, the gods created humans, but the gods involved were Enki, Nintu, and Enlil, not some distinct group called the Anunnaki, and the creation process involved mixing clay with the blood of a sacrificed god, a thoroughly mythological process with clear ritual and symbolic meanings. The clay represents earth and mortality. The divine blood represents the spark of life and intelligence. The mixture represents the hybrid nature of humanity, part dust, part divine, capable of thought and creation but bound to death and decay. Ancient readers understood these myths as explanations for human nature. Why do we die? Because we're made of clay, which returns to dust. Why do we have consciousness? Because we have divine blood mixed into our essence. Why do we have to work? Because we were created specifically to relieve the gods of labor. These aren't literal descriptions of genetic engineering. They're mythological explanations for existential questions, using the language and concepts available to Bronze Age Mesopotamians who knew nothing about DNA, evolution, or molecular biology. The modern myth of the Anunnaki as ancient astronauts serves a very different purpose than the original Sumerian myths. The Sumerian myths explained why the world was the way it was within their cultural and theological framework. The modern myth provides a narrative where humanity's problems are blamed on external manipulation, where ancient wisdom was supposedly suppressed by mainstream archaeology, where believers can feel they have special knowledge that the establishment refuses to acknowledge. It's conspiracy thinking dressed up with cherry-picked ancient terminology. And it's harmful, not because it's silly, plenty of harmless entertainment involves ancient aliens, but because it undermines real archaeology and real history. When people believe that mainstream scholars are hiding the truth about Sumerian tablets, they become skeptical of all academic scholarship. When Sitchin's mistranslations are presented as more reliable than actual Sumerologists who spent their careers learning dead languages, it devalues expertise and creates a space where anyone can claim anything about the past without accountability. The result is cultural noise, a flood of misinformation that makes it harder for people to learn what Sumerian civilization actually accomplished and believed. Part 5. The actual prison mortality, servitude, and cosmic boundaries. So if Kur is the underworld prison from which no one escapes, and if humanity was created for servitude, what was daily life like for the Sumerians living within this cosmological system? How did these beliefs shape their culture, their rituals, their psychology? This is where the tablets become most valuable, because they document not just grand myths, but the practical applications of these beliefs in everyday life. The Sumerians understood themselves to be property of the gods. Not metaphorically, but legally and theologically. Each city-state had a patron god who was considered the city's actual owner. Belonged to Nana, the moon god. Uruk belonged to Inanna, goddess of love and war. Nippur belonged to Enlil. The king ruled as the god's steward, the high priest managed the god's temple and property, and the population existed as the god's servants. Temple lands were the largest economic entities in each city, employing thousands of workers, owning vast agricultural estates, controlling trade networks. These weren't just religious centers, they were the economic backbone of Sumerian civilization. Workers at the temples received rations of barley, beer, oil and wool as payment. These rations were calculated precisely, recorded on tablets, and distributed according to complex hierarchies. A high priest received more than a common laborer. Skilled craftsmen received more than field workers. Women and children received smaller portions than adult men. The entire system was documented meticulously, creating an enormous archive of economic tablets that modern archaeologists have used to reconstruct Sumerian daily life in fine detail. We know what people ate, how much they were paid, what their work schedules looked like because it was all written down. But the purpose of this labor wasn't just economics, it was religious obligation. The gods needed to be fed, clothed, and entertained. Every day, temple personnel prepared meals for the god's statue, offering bread, meat, beer, and incense at prescribed times. The god was believed to actually consume the essence of the food, leaving the physical substance for the priests and temple workers to eat afterwards. This wasn't considered theft or fraud. It was understood as the proper flow of resources. Humans produce food through agriculture. Humans offer food to the gods who make agriculture possible. Gods consume the essence and return the physical food to nourish the servants who produced it. A closed system of obligations and benefits. Rituals marked every significant moment and transition. Birth rituals welcomed new humans into the social structure and placed them under the protection of household gods. Coming-of-age ceremonies marked the transition to adulthood and full participation in labor and worship. Marriage rituals established new households and created alliances between families, always with a religious sanction and divine witnesses. Death rituals were especially elaborate because they managed the dangerous transition from the world of the living to the realm of Kur. Every step had to be performed correctly, or the deceased might become a restless ghost, or worse, might suffer enhanced torment in the underworld for having improper rites. Funerals involved wrapping the body in cloth or matting, placing it in a simple coffin or directly in the ground, and burying it beneath the floor of the family house or in designated cemetery areas outside the city. Grave goods were included, personal possessions, tools, weapons, jewelry, food offerings. These items were believed to accompany the deceased into Kur, where they would establish the person's status and provide some measure of comfort in that dusty realm. The wealthy were buried with more elaborate goods, sometimes including precious metals, lapis lazuli, and even sacrificed servants in the case of royalty. The royal tombs of excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, contained evidence of human sacrifice, with attendants apparently taking poison or being killed so they could serve their masters in the afterlife. But even with offerings and proper rituals, Kur remained a dismal fate. The Sumerian poems that describe the underworld emphasize its horrors: darkness without relief, dust for bread, muddy water for drink, no hope of return, no possibility of change. The dead wore feathers like birds, making them appear simultaneously pathetic and alien, no longer fully human. They were called Giddim in Sumerian, meaning ghosts or shades, entities that had once been people but were now reduced to shadows. The living feared becoming Giddim, but they also feared the Giddim of others, because neglected ghosts could return to plague their relatives, causing illness, misfortune, and death. This created a perpetual obligation for the living to maintain offerings to the dead. At regular intervals, families would pour water onto the grave, leave food offerings, and recite prayers on behalf of the deceased. As long as someone living remembered you and provided these offerings, your existence in Ker remained stable. But if your family line died out, if your name was forgotten, you became one of the wandering dead, hungry and desperate, liable to attack the living out of jealous spite. This meant that having children, particularly sons who would maintain the family cult, was crucial not just for lineage, but for one's eternal fate. A person without descendants was doomed to a worse existence in Ker than someone whose name was remembered and whose offerings continued. The fear of being forgotten produced one of Sumerian civilization's most distinctive features, the obsessive recording of names on monuments, tablets, temple inscriptions, and royal dedications. Kings listed their ancestors for dozens of generations. Priests inscribed their names on statues and foundation deposits. Scribes included their names in the colophons of tablets they copied. This wasn't mere vanity, though vanity certainly played a role. It was a desperate attempt to achieve a kind of immortality through memory, through having one's name spoken and recorded long after death. If your name survived, a part of you survived, and even if no living descendant could provide offerings, the speaking of the name itself had power. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which drew on Sumerian traditions though it was written in Akkadian, centers entirely on this tension between the mortality and the desire for immortality. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, watches his friend Enkidu die and descend to Ker, and is overcome with existential terror. He undertakes a long journey seeking the secret of immortality, eventually finding Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood who was granted immortality by the gods. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh that immortality is not available to humans, that the gods keep it for themselves, that death is the universal human fate. Gilgamesh eventually accepts this truth, but he finds solace in the walls of Uruk, the city he built which will bear his name long after his death. His immortality is through his works, through the memory of his deeds, through the tablets that record his story. This is the authentic Sumerian response to mortality. Build something that lasts, achieve fame, have your name recorded, and accept that physical death is inevitable, but memory provides a form of continuity. It's not comforting in the modern sense. There's no promise of reward, no reunion with loved ones, no transcendence to a better place. Just the hope that you won't be entirely forgotten, that someone somewhere will pour water on your grave or speak your name or read about your deeds. Part 6. The God's Behavior Power Without Morality. Understanding the Sumerian cosmic prison requires understanding the nature of the gods who designed it. Modern people, especially those raised in monotheistic traditions, tend to assume that gods should be moral exemplars, beings who embody justice, love, wisdom, and compassion. The Sumerian gods were not like this. They were powerful, certainly, and they demanded worship, but they were not omnibenevolent, and they were not particularly concerned with human welfare except insofar as it affected their own comfort. The myths portray gods as petty, jealous, violent, lustful, and often drunk. They raped, murdered, lied, cheated, and threw tantrums when they didn't get their way. Enlil raped the goddess Ninlil, then was punished by being exiled to the underworld, but later was restored to power because the other gods needed him. Inanna stole the divine powers and cultural gifts from Enki by getting him drunk and convincing him to give them away. The gods went to war with each other, destroyed cities, flooded the world to stop noise that bothered them. They were in every meaningful sense superhuman but not supermoral, immortal but not wise, powerful but not just. This creates a cosmos where humans are subject to the whims of beings who don't necessarily have humanity's best interests at heart. Enlil decided to destroy all humans because their noise disturbed his sleep. Think about that logic. Not because humans were wicked, not because they violated some moral code, but because they were loud. The Sumerian flood wasn't divine judgment on sin, it was noise control. Enki saved Atrahasis and his family not because they were righteous, but because Enki liked humans and thought complete destruction was wasteful. The other gods agreed to preserve humanity primarily because they needed someone to provide offerings and labor. This is a cosmology without cosmic justice. Bad things happen to good people all the time, and there was no guarantee of reward for virtue or punishment for wickedness. You could live a pious life, perform all the correct rituals, provide generous offerings, and still suffer disease, poverty, military defeat, or early death because some god was angry about something unrelated, or because a demon took interest in you, or simply because fate had decreed your suffering. The gods might help you if you prayed correctly and offered enough sacrifices, but they might not. They had their own concerns, their own conflicts, their own pleasures to pursue. Divination became crucial in this environment because if the gods weren't obligated to be fair, humans needed any possible advance warning of divine intentions. Sumerian priests developed elaborate systems for reading omens, examining the liver and entrails of sacrificed animals, observing the flight patterns of birds, interpreting dreams, watching the movements of planets and stars, noting unusual weather or natural phenomena. Every unusual occurrence was potentially a divine message. A spider in the house might predict wealth or disaster, depending on its color and direction of movement. The appearance of a lunar halo indicated divine displeasure. Oil poured into water and observed for its spreading pattern could reveal whether a planned business venture would succeed. These weren't superstitions in the pejorative sense. They were systematic attempts to navigate an unpredictable cosmos ruled by capricious powers. If you could interpret the signs correctly, you might be able to adjust your behavior, perform the right rituals, or simply avoid dangerous actions until the omens improved. Massive compendia of omens were compiled on tablets, listing situations and their meanings. If a man sees a white dog at sunrise, he will receive good news. If he sees a black dog at sunset, he will suffer loss. Thousands of these omen texts have been recovered, showing how extensively the Sumerians and their successors tried to systematize divine communication. But even with perfect knowledge of omens, even with flawless ritual performance, humans remained fundamentally vulnerable. The gods could change their minds, fate could overrule even divine promises. Demons operated semi-independently, causing harm without any particular reason or authorization. The cosmos was not ordered according to moral principles, it was ordered according to power, and humans had very little power. This absence of moral cosmology is perhaps the most alien aspect of Sumerian thought for modern people. We're accustomed to religions that promise justice, whether in this life or the next. Buddhism teaches karma and reincarnation until enlightenment. Christianity promises heaven for the faithful and hell for the wicked. Islam teaches divine judgment and eternal reward or punishment based on deeds. Modern secular humanism assumes moral progress and the possibility of building a better world. The Sumerians had none of this. The universe was not fair. Death came to all. The afterlife was miserable for everyone except those who received offerings from the living. Power determined outcomes, not righteousness. Yet Sumerians still developed ethical codes, laws, and moral principles. They valued honesty, loyalty, compassion, and justice in human relationships. The laws of Ur-Nammu and the later Code of Hammurabi demonstrate sophisticated legal thinking about proportional punishment, protection of the weak, and social responsibility. Wisdom literature like the instructions of Shurippak taught virtues like humility, diligence, and careful speech. Sumerians clearly believed that ethical behavior made society function better, even if it didn't guarantee divine favor. The disconnect between divine behavior and human morality created a particular kind of religious psychology. You worshipped the gods because they were powerful and you needed their favor, not because they were good. You performed rituals correctly because mistakes angered the gods, not because the rituals had inherent moral value. You lived ethically because it improved your social relationships and reputation, not because the gods cared about your ethical behavior. In a sense, the Sumerians anticipated the separation of ethics and religion that modern secular philosophy promotes, though for different reasons. They were ethical despite their gods, not because of them. Part 7. Boundaries and Barriers, the Architecture of Cosmic Control. The Sumerian cosmos was structured around boundaries, both physical and metaphysical, that maintained order by keeping different realms and beings separate. Understanding these boundaries is crucial to understanding how the system functioned as a kind of prison, because boundaries defined what was possible, what was forbidden, and what transgression meant. The primary boundary was between heaven and earth, established when Enlil separated an above from key below at the beginning of creation. This wasn't just physical separation, it was conceptual separation, the establishment of distinct domains with different rules, different inhabitants, different properties. Heaven was the realm of eternal beings, of light and power, where gods dwelt in leisure. Earth was the realm of mortal beings, of labour and growth, where humans and animals lived and died. The boundary between them was real and enforced. Humans couldn't ascend to heaven, gods could descend to earth, but when they did, they were voluntarily entering a different domain with different constraints. Certain locations were understood as threshold spaces where the boundary between heaven and earth became permeable. Temples, particularly the ziggurat towers that rose above Sumerian cities, were conceived as cosmic mountains, places where heaven and earth met. The ziggurat at Ur, dedicated to Nana the moon god, rose in stepped levels symbolizing the ascent from earthly to divine realms. Priests performing rituals at the summit were understood to be at the boundary, able to communicate with the gods more directly because they were physically closer to heaven and spiritually attuned through purification and training. But even priests couldn't truly cross into heaven. They could approach the boundary, could speak across it, could receive divine messages, but the separation remained fundamental. Only in myths did humans visit heaven, and these myths served to emphasize the impossibility of such journeys in normal circumstances. Adapa, a wise priest of Enki, was summoned to heaven by the god and to answer for breaking the wing of the south wind. Enki warned Adapa not to accept any food or drink in heaven, because mortals who consumed divine substances would die. But when An, impressed by Adapa's wisdom, offered him the bread and water of eternal life, Adapa refused, following Enki's advice, and laughed at the trick, and Adapa lost his chance at immortality. The story functioned as an explanation for why humans remain mortal, even when offered immortality. Human limitations and divine deception conspired to deny it. The boundary between Earth and the underworld was more complex, because it had to be traversed regularly, but also had to remain secure enough that the dead didn't escape. The gates of Kur served this function, 7 gates each guarded, each requiring a price or sacrifice to pass. Living humans could theoretically reach these gates through specific geographical locations: caves, fissures in the earth, the mouths of rivers where water disappeared underground, but actually entering required either death, special divine permission, or extraordinary circumstances that appear only in myths. Inanna's descent required her to announce her intention to the gatekeeper Neti, who consulted with Ereshkigal before allowing entry. At each of the 7 gates, Inanna had to remove one of her divine garments or symbols of power until she entered the throne room of the underworld, completely naked and powerless. This stripping wasn't arbitrary. It represented the necessary process of leaving behind earthly and divine status before entering the realm of death. The gates enforced the boundary by transforming those who passed through them, ensuring that even gods became vulnerable once they entered Kur's domain. Returning from Kur was even more difficult. Inanna's escape required divine intervention from Enki, who sent 2 sexless creatures who could sneak through the gates and rescue her. But even divine rescue came with a price. Inanna had to provide a substitute, someone to take her place in Kur. She chose her husband Dumuzi, who was dragged back to the underworld by demons. Eventually Dumuzi's sister Geshtinanna volunteered to spend half the year in Kur, so Dumuzi could spend half the year on Earth, explaining the cycle of seasons in Sumerian agricultural metaphor. The boundary could be crossed, but balance had to be maintained. Kur required its inhabitants. Demons and evil spirits represented boundary violations in the other direction. These beings originated in or were associated with Kur, but they could cross into the world of the living under certain conditions. The Gala demons who dragged Dumuzi to the underworld were regular crossers, hunting for substitutes and troublemakers. Other demons caused disease, nightmares, complications in childbirth, madness, crop failures. They weren't automatically malevolent toward humans, but they operated according to different rules than mortals, and their presence in the human realm was inherently dangerous. Protection against demons required understanding boundaries and how to reinforce them. Amulets inscribed with prayers or images of protective gods could create personal boundaries that demons couldn't cross. Doorways were particularly vulnerable points, so threshold rituals and protective symbols were common. The clay figures called substitute figures or figurines were sometimes buried under doorways or at the corners of houses to serve as decoys that demons would attack instead of the human inhabitants. This wasn't magic in the fantasy sense. It was applied theology, practical manipulation of the cosmic rules that the Sumerians understood through observation and tradition. Time itself had boundaries. The Sumerians tracked multiple overlapping calendars, lunar months of approximately 29 or 30 days, solar years of 12 or 13 lunar months with intercalary months added to keep seasons aligned, and regnal years counted from the accession of each new king. Each month was associated with specific festivals and required rituals. Missing a festival or performing it incorrectly violated temporal boundaries, potentially angering the gods and disrupting the cosmic order. The New Year festival, called Akitu, in later Babylonian tradition but with Sumerian precedents, was the most important temporal boundary crossing. It marked the transition from Old Year to New Year, symbolizing death and rebirth, chaos and reordering. The king's role in the festival was crucial because the king embodied the connection between human and divine realms. In some versions of the Akitu, the king underwent a ritual humiliation where he was stripped of his regalia and forced to declare his innocence and proper service to the gods before being restored to power. This ritual reinforced that even royal power derived from divine authority and had to be renewed periodically. Death was, of course, the ultimate boundary crossing for individuals, the transition from being Ug, living person, to being Giddim, ghost. This transition was managed through elaborate funeral rites precisely because it was so dangerous. An improperly handled death created a ghost that didn't successfully reach Kur, leaving it trapped between worlds, angry and capable of harming the living. The mourning period, the offerings, the burial, the installation of grave markers, all of these practices were boundary management, ensuring the dead completed their transition rather than getting stuck at the threshold. Physical boundaries also carried theological significance. City walls weren't just military fortifications. They defined the civilized space under a particular god's protection versus the wild lands beyond. Outside, the city was foreign, potentially chaotic, the realm where demons and wild animals dwelt. Inside was order, law, divine presence manifested through the temple. Gates and city walls were threshold spaces that required purification and protective rituals. Travelers entering a city often stopped at the gate to perform cleansing rites or prayers before proceeding into the civilized interior. These multiple boundaries, vertical between heaven, earth, and underworld, temporal between past, present, and future, spatial between civilized and wild, between city and city, between living and dead, created a complex network of constraints that defined Sumerian existence. You couldn't freely move between categories. You couldn't escape your designated realm or role. Even gods, who had far more freedom than humans, operated within these constraints. Enlil couldn't simply ignore Kur. Ereshkigal couldn't abandon the underworld. Enki couldn't override the fundamental structures of creation even if he wanted to help humans. This is what made the Sumerian cosmos a prison, not in the literal sense of walls and guards, but in the structural sense of boundaries that couldn't be permanently transgressed, roles that couldn't be abandoned, fates that couldn't be escaped. You were mortal because that's how humans were made. You served the gods because that's why humans was created. You would descend to Kur when you died because that's where dead humans went. These weren't choices or punishments for specific crimes. They were the fundamental architecture of reality as the Sumerians understood it. Part 8. Rituals of maintenance keeping the prison functional. The Sumerian cosmic system required constant maintenance. Unlike the clockwork universe of later Enlightenment thinking, where natural laws operated automatically once set in motion, the Sumerian cosmos needed ongoing divine attention and human support to function properly. This created an elaborate structure of rituals, offerings, festivals, and prayers that, occupied enormous amounts of human labor and resources. Understanding these rituals helps us see how the prison operated on a practical, daily basis. The most basic ritual was the daily feeding of the gods. Every major temple maintained a schedule of offerings that had to be performed at specific times without fail. Dawn offerings to welcome the god's awakening, midday meals, evening offerings as the god prepared for rest, midnight offerings for certain deities associated with night. These weren't symbolic gestures. They were understood as actual feeding, providing the gods with the sustenance they needed to maintain their power and continue their cosmic functions. If the gods weren't fed, they would weaken, and if they weakened, the order of creation itself might fail. The offerings varied by god, time of year, and purpose. Grain offerings were most common, especially barley, which was the staple crop of Mesopotamia. Bread made from barley flour, sometimes sweetened with honey or flavored with herbs, was presented on special offering tables. Beer, another barley product essential to Sumerian diet and culture, was offered in large quantities. The Sumerians were sophisticated brewers with multiple varieties of beer, from thick, nutrient-dense brews that were almost like liquid bread to lighter, more refined varieties for special occasions. The gods received the best beer, carefully brewed and ritually prepared. Animal sacrifices were regular but less frequent than grain offerings, reserved for important occasions or when special intercession was needed. Sheep and goats were most common, with cattle used for major festivals. The animal had to be unblemished, healthy, and properly consecrated before sacrifice. The killing was performed by trained priests using specific techniques to minimize suffering and ensure ritual purity. Blood was especially important, considered the seat of life force, and was handled with elaborate precautions. Some blood would be offered to the god, some might be spread on the altar or temple door, some carefully disposed of in ways that prevented contamination or misuse. After the god had consumed the essence of the offerings, which happened invisibly, understood through faith and ritual logic rather than observable change, the physical remainder became temple property. Priests and temple workers ate the sacrificial meat, consumed the beer and bread, and used the grain as payment for labor. This wasn't corruption, it was the understood economic flow. The god received spiritual sustenance, humans received physical sustenance, and the system sustained both divine and mortal communities. But it required constant labor, constant production, constant attention to detail. The hymn to the Akor, one of the major temple complexes in Nippur, describes in extensive detail the offerings and services required to properly maintain the god's house. The text lists the personnel involved, the Sangha priest who oversaw the entire operation, the Luma priests who performed major rituals, the Guru priests who handled daily offerings, the Nindagir priestesses who sang hymns and performed music, the Idubla scribes who recorded everything, the musicians with their various instruments, the craftsmen who maintained temple property, the agricultural workers who produced the grain and raised the animals, the brewers who made the beer. Hundreds of people were required to keep a single major temple functioning properly. Beyond daily offerings, the calendar was filled with festivals, each requiring special preparations and performances. Monthly festivals marked the new moon and full moon, cosmologically significant moments when the boundary between human time and divine time became more permeable. The god's attention was believed to be more focused on human affairs during these times, making it both an opportunity for petitions and a danger if rituals were performed incorrectly. Annual festivals celebrated specific events in a god's mythological cycle, agricultural milestones, military victories, or political anniversaries. The sacred marriage ritual, performed in various Sumerian cities, but especially prominent in Uruk, involved the king ritually marrying Inanna, the goddess of love and fertility. This wasn't just symbolic pageantry, it was understood as a real cosmic event where divine and human realms merged temporarily, renewing the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the city. The ritual involved extensive preparation, purification of the participants, creation of special costumes and regalia, composition of hymns for the occasion, preparation of the ceremonial bed, gathering of witnesses and participants. The king and a high priestess representing Inanna would enact the marriage, including sexual consummation, which was believed to magically ensure good harvests and successful births throughout the coming year. Modern scholars debate whether the sexual component was literally enacted or was symbolic theatre, but the Sumerian texts describing the ritual are fairly explicit, suggesting actual sexual activity was involved. From a Sumerian perspective, this made perfect sense. If fertility in fields and flocks required the blessing of Inanna, and if that blessing was most powerfully transmitted through sexual union, then the ritual required real sex. The participants weren't just actors. They were temporarily embodying divine essences, becoming vessels for the god's presence and power. The king wasn't pretending to be Inanna's husband. For the duration of the ritual, he was her husband, and she, through the priestess, was actually present. These rituals required enormous resources. The sacred marriage festival at Uruk involved providing food and drink for thousands of participants and spectators, creating special garments that were used once and then dedicated to the temple, compensating the many priests and officials involved, and maintaining the sacred precincts where the ritual took place. But the Sumerians considered these expenditures necessary, not optional. If the ritual wasn't performed, or was performed incorrectly, the consequences could be catastrophic. Crop failures, plague, military defeats, divine abandonment of the city. Building and maintaining temples was another major ritual obligation. Temples weren't just constructed once. They required constant repair due to mud brick construction, deteriorating in the harsh Mesopotamian climate. Kings gained prestige by rebuilding or expanding temples, dedicating the work to the patron god and inscribing their names on foundation deposits. These inscriptions served multiple purposes. They recorded the king's piety for posterity, they invoked divine protection on the structure, and they warned future kings who might want to take credit for the building that the gods knew who truly built it and would punish impostors. Foundation rituals for new temples or major renovations were elaborate multi-day affairs. First, the site had to be purified, often by performing exorcisms to drive away any demons or malevolent spirits. Then, omens were taken to confirm that the gods approved of the location and timing. Special consecrated bricks were made, sometimes with prayers inscribed on them or precious objects embedded within them. The first bricks were laid by the king himself in a ceremonial act, though the actual construction was performed by skilled labourers and craftsmen. When the temple was completed, dedication ceremonies installed the god's statue in the Holy of Holies, effectively inviting the divine presence to inhabit the structure. From that moment forward, the temple was alive in a sense, animated by the god's presence and requiring constant care. Priests underwent extensive training and purification to perform these rituals correctly. Being a priest wasn't just a job. It was a lifelong commitment requiring specialized knowledge, physical purity, and spiritual discipline. Priests learned to read and write cuneiform, memorized hundreds of hymns and prayers, studied the movement of stars and planets for astrological divination, learned the properties of plants and minerals for use in rituals and medicine, and mastered the complex protocols for interacting with the divine. Different priestly offices required different expertise. A divination priest needed to know omen lore. An exorcism priest needed to know spells and protective rituals. A temple administrator needed to know accounting and management. Purity requirements were stringent. Before performing major rituals, priests had to bathe in sanctified water, abstain from sex, avoid contact with corpses or other sources of contamination, and sometimes fast or restrict their diet. Certain priests were required to shave their heads and bodies completely. Others wore special garments that couldn't be worn outside the temple. The logic was that interaction with the divine required the human participant to be in a liminal state, separated from normal human concerns and contaminations, made as close to divine purity as mortal nature allowed. Failing to meet purity requirements could anger the god, resulting in the ritual failing or worse, divine retribution against the priest or the community. Women played significant roles in temple service, though the specifics varied by city and deity. Priestesses served Inanna Ishtar extensively, and certain female roles like the Entu priestess at Ur held tremendous prestige and power. But priestesses also faced unique restrictions. Some were required to remain celibate for life, dedicated entirely to the god with no family or children. Others were ritual prostitutes, a term that's controversial among modern scholars but appears to reflect reality in some contexts. These women performed sacred sex acts as part of fertility rituals, embodying the goddess's power and blessing, participants with divine favor. This wasn't exploitation in their cultural context. It was sacred service, compensated and respected, though undoubtedly some women were coerced and others suffered from the arrangement. The economic impact of temple service was immense. Temples were the largest employers in most Sumerian cities, controlling vast estates, employing thousands of workers, and managing complex trade networks. They owned fields, orchards, and pastures. They ran textile workshops where women wove cloth from wool provided by temple flocks. They maintained workshops for metalworking, pottery, carpentry, and stone carving. They owned boats for river trade and warehouses for storage. All of this economic activity was ultimately in service to the gods, providing the resources needed for offerings and maintaining the temple establishment. But temples also provided social services. They functioned as banks, lending grain and silver to individuals and taking land or labor as collateral. They served as courts where disputes could be adjudicated, with priests acting as judges who invoked divine wisdom in their decisions. They operated as schools, training the next generation of scribes and priests in reading, writing, mathematics, and religious knowledge. They provided charity to the poor, at least nominally, distributing excess food from offerings and supporting widows, orphans, and the disabled, who had no other means of support. Whether this charity was generous or minimal is debated, but the principle was established that gods cared for the vulnerable, and temples as the gods' households had obligations to the suffering. Royal ideology reinforced the temple system. Kings claimed their authority derived from divine selection, that the gods had chosen them to rule and maintain order. This wasn't just propaganda, though it certainly served political purposes. It was deeply believed by the population and probably by the kings themselves. A king who neglected temple obligations, who failed to rebuild sanctuaries or provide offerings, risked divine abandonment. There are texts describing how gods became angry with cities and allowed them to be defeated by enemies because the king or population had failed in their religious duties. Uruk was sacked, Ur was destroyed, Lagash was conquered, always with theological explanations that the god of the city had withdrawn protection due to human failures. This created a feedback loop where political power required religious legitimacy, which required extensive temple service and offering, which required economic resources extracted through taxation and labor obligations, which required political power to enforce. The system was self-reinforcing. A successful king could afford lavish temple building and offerings, which secured divine favor, which led to military victories and prosperity, which provided resources for more temple building. A failing king couldn't maintain the temples, which led to divine anger, which led to defeats and disasters, which further reduced resources, accelerating the decline. Natural disasters, military defeats, famines, and plagues were all interpreted through this theological lens. The Lament for Ur, a long poem describing the destruction of Ur by Elamite invaders around 2,000 years before the Common Era, attributes the city's fall to Nanna the moon god abandoning his temple. The goddess Ningal, Nanna's consort, pleads with the divine assembly to spare the city, but they decree its destruction. The poem doesn't blame the invaders or poor military strategy. It blames divine withdrawal, which occurred because humans had somehow failed in their obligations. The solution wasn't better fortifications or larger armies. It was better temple service, more offerings, greater piety. This theological interpretation of history meant that the Sumerian cosmos prison was enforced not just by cosmic structure, but by constant fear of punishment. Step out of line, fail in your ritual obligations, allow offerings to lapse, permit the temple to fall into disrepair, and the gods would respond with tangible suffering. You couldn't escape through better behavior either, because the gods were capricious. They might punish you even if you did everything correctly, if they were angry about something else or simply felt like asserting their power. The only safety was in constant, meticulous performance of all required rituals, and even then, safety was never guaranteed. Part 9. Wisdom Literature Accepting the Prison. The Sumerians developed extensive wisdom literature, texts that offered advice on living well within the cosmic constraints they faced. These texts are fascinating because they show how people adapted psychologically to a reality they couldn't change, finding meaning and purpose within a system that offered no escape from mortality, servitude, or eventual consignment to a dusty underworld. The wisdom they developed is sometimes moving, sometimes cynical, always pragmatic. The Instructions of Shurapak is one of the oldest surviving wisdom texts, dating to around 2600 years before the Common Era in its written form, though probably much older in oral tradition. It's framed as advice from a father to his son, covering everything from business ethics to table manners to dealing with authority. The tone is practical rather than abstract, focused on how to navigate social hierarchies and avoid trouble rather than pursuing virtue for its own sake. Don't pass judgment when you drink beer, the text advises, recognizing that altered states reduce judgment and can lead to conflicts. Don't make your son's wife stand in the street, meaning don't expose your family to public shame or danger. Don't vouch for someone. That person will have a hold on you. Practical advice about not taking responsibility for others' debts or actions. The text emphasizes caution, moderation, and maintaining good relationships with those who have power over you. It's survival wisdom, teaching the son how to live safely in a hierarchical, often dangerous world. The text also advises, "My son, don't sit alone in a chamber with a married woman." This isn't moral teaching about adultery being wrong. It's practical teaching about protecting your reputation and avoiding accusations that could get you killed. Don't travel during the night because demons and bandits operate after dark and there's no advantage worth the risk. Don't bring a free woman from the street into your house as a servant, because social boundaries must be maintained, and violating them brings trouble. What's absent from the instructions is any promise that following the advice will bring divine favor or eternal reward. The goal is avoiding trouble, maintaining status, and surviving in a difficult world. The gods appear in the text mainly as sources of power that must be respected, not as moral exemplars to be emulated. This reflects the Sumerian understanding that ethics and theology were separate domains. You behaved ethically to make human society function, not because the gods cared. Another wisdom text, the Dialogue of Pessimism, presents a more cynical view. In this text, a master asks his servant about various activities. Should I make love to a woman? Should I eat dinner? Should I lead a rebellion? Should I do public good? And each time the servant first argues for the activity, then when the master changes his mind, argues against it. The servant can justify any action and its opposite, showing that life has no inherent meaning, that all activities lead eventually to the same end, death and dust. The dialogue concludes with the master asking what is good, and the servant responding that having one's neck broken and being thrown in the river is good. When asked who is so tall that they can reach to heaven, or so broad that they can embrace the underworld, the servant responds that no one can. The text is profoundly nihilistic, suggesting that in a cosmos where death claims all, where the gods are capricious, where no action guarantees good outcomes, perhaps the only rational response is recognizing life's emptiness. Yet even this pessimistic text exists, which suggests the Sumerians could contemplate meaninglessness without descending into complete despair. The dialogue doesn't advocate suicide. It doesn't urge rebellion against the gods. It simply acknowledges the dark reality of existence and suggests perhaps that acknowledgement itself is a form of wisdom, even if it offers no comfort. Proverbs collected from various Sumerian sources show similar pragmatism. Wealth is hard to find, poverty is always near. What is the profit of doing good? Your enemy will grow old. You can have a master, you can have a king, but the man to fear is the tax collector. Possessions make a man feel secure. He says, I have possessions, let me enjoy life. These aren't optimistic affirmations. They're acknowledgements of how the world actually works, warnings to not expect fairness, encouragement to find what pleasure you can. Some proverbs do advocate virtue. Do not speak arrogance and lies, then you will be a man. The poor man is better off dead than alive. If he has bread, he has no salt. If he has salt, he has no bread. Wait, that second one isn't advocating virtue at all. It's just describing poverty's misery. The Sumerians weren't particularly good at sugarcoating reality. Personal laments and prayers show individuals grappling with suffering and seeking divine help. These prayers are remarkably direct, sometimes even accusatory. My God, the day shines bright over the land. For me, the day is black. I cry out to my God, but he does not show his face. The supplicants aren't meekly accepting divine will. They're demanding explanation, asking why they suffer when they've done nothing wrong, questioning divine justice. One remarkable prayer text asks, "How long, my goddess, until you have mercy on me?" The supplicant lists all the correct rituals performed, all the offerings made, all the prayers said, and asks why suffering continues despite faithful service. The goddess doesn't answer in the text. There's no reassurance that the suffering has meaning or will end. The prayer simply stops after laying out the complaint, as if the very act of voicing it is the only relief available. This reflects the Sumerian understanding that gods weren't required to explain themselves. You could ask why, but you might not get an answer. You could perform every ritual perfectly and still suffer. The wisdom literature acknowledges this reality without offering false hope. The best you could do was maintain proper relationships with the gods, live prudently, find what pleasure was available, and accept that death would come for everyone eventually. The concept of personal gods added another layer to this psychology. Each individual was believed to have a personal god or goddess who served as their patron and protector, interceding with the more powerful deities on their behalf. When you suffered, one interpretation was that your personal god had withdrawn their protection, perhaps because you had offended them, or perhaps simply because they were overwhelmed by more powerful divine forces. You could pray to your personal god to return, make offerings, perform rituals of reconciliation, but there was no guarantee they would respond. This created a theology where religious practice was deeply personal and individualized, but also precarious. Your relationship with your personal god wasn't based on cosmic justice or moral worth. It was based on service, attention, and the god's often inexplicable favor or disfavor. You maintained the relationship through constant small offerings, through wearing amulets bearing the god's image, through invoking their name in daily prayers. But ultimately, like any relationship with a more powerful being, you were dependent on their goodwill, which could be withdrawn at any time. The wisdom literature also contains what we might call practical magic, texts that teach how to manipulate cosmic forces for protection or benefit. Incantations against demons describe exactly what words to speak, what materials to use, what times are most effective. These aren't separate from religious practice. They're applied theology, using knowledge of how the cosmic prison operates to navigate it more safely. If you know demons can't cross certain boundaries, you create those boundaries. If you know certain divine names have power over certain forces, you invoke those names. If you know certain plants or minerals have protective properties, you use them. This magical practice wasn't seen as coercing the gods or violating divine will. It was using the rules the gods themselves had established. The cosmos had structure, laws, patterns. Learning those patterns and working within them was considered wise and not blasphemous. It's similar to how modern people don't consider using medicine to be defying God's will about disease. We're using natural laws to achieve desired outcomes. The Sumerians did the same, just with a different understanding of what those laws were. One area where wisdom literature becomes especially poignant is in confronting mortality. Multiple texts exist that explore the meaning of life given inevitable death. The Death of Gilgamesh, Sumerian poem separate from the later Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh, describes the hero's realization that he will die despite his great deeds. The gods tell Gilgamesh that they created him as a great warrior and king, but they did not give him eternal life. That gift is reserved for the gods alone. Gilgamesh must accept death and find meaning in his legacy, in the walls he built, the enemies he defeated, the stories that will be told about him. This represents the Sumerian answer to existential dread. You can't escape death, so find meaning in what you accomplish before death claims you. Build something lasting. Have children who will remember you and make offerings. Achieve fame through great deeds. Rule justly so you'll be remembered with honor. These don't extend your life, but they extend your influence beyond your life, which is the closest thing to immortality available to mortals. The lack of moral recompense in the afterlife made this earthly legacy even more important. There was no heavenly reward for virtue, no escape from Kur for the righteous. Everyone ended up in the same dusty realm. The only distinctions in death were based on status maintained through offerings. A king with descendants who maintained elaborate offerings might exist more comfortably in Kur than a peasant quickly forgotten. But both were still in Kur, both still eating dust, both still in darkness. The prison released no one, regardless of their behavior in life. Part 10, The Epic of Gilgamesh, The Futility of Escape. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though written in Akkadian and dating from a later period than the pure Sumerian texts, draws heavily on Sumerian traditions and represents the fullest exploration of the cosmic prison theme. The epic is fundamentally about a man trying to escape mortality, trying to break out of the system and failing completely. It's the story of discovering that the prison has no exit, that the boundaries are absolute, and that acceptance is the only viable response. Gilgamesh is king of Uruk, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human according to the text, which gives him superhuman strength and abilities but doesn't exempt him from mortality. He's a tyrant initially, exhausting his people with constant building projects and claiming sexual rights over all brides before their husbands. The gods hear the complaints and create Enkidu, a wild man who lives with animals, as a rival who might distract Gilgamesh from his oppression. Enkidu is civilized through contact with a temple prostitute who sleeps with him for 6 days and 7 nights, after which the animals reject him and he gains human speech and understanding. This transformation from wild to civilized happens through sex and bread and beer, the markers of human culture versus animal existence. Enkidu then travels to Uruk where he challenges Gilgamesh. They fight, neither can defeat the other, and they become close friends, essentially brothers. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu undertake heroic adventures, most famously journeying to the cedar forest to kill Humbaba, the guardian monster. They offend the goddess Ishtar, who offers to marry Gilgamesh but is refused because Gilgamesh lists all her previous lovers and how she destroyed them. Ishtar sends the Bull of Heaven to destroy Uruk in revenge, but Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill it. These are classic hero tales, demonstrations of human power and cleverness overcoming supernatural threats. But the gods decide that one of the two friends must die as punishment for killing Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven. They choose Enkidu. He falls ill, suffers for 12 days, and dies. Before death, he has a vision of the underworld, which he describes to Gilgamesh. The house from which no one exits, the road from which there is no return, the place where dust is their bread and clay their food, where light is never seen and inhabitants are clothed like birds in feathers. It's the standard Sumerian description of Kur, emphasizing its finality and misery. Gilgamesh is devastated by Enkidu's death. He refuses to believe his friend is truly gone, sits with the corpse for 7 days until maggots fall from the nose, proving that death is real and irreversible. This loss triggers an existential crisis in Gilgamesh. If Enkidu, who is strong and brave and accomplished, can die, then Gilgamesh himself will die. And if Gilgamesh will die, then everything he's done, all his power and glory, leads to the same end as the lowest slave, darkness and dust in Kur. He decides to seek immortality. He's heard of Utnapishtim, the survivor of the flood who was granted eternal life by the gods. If Gilgamesh can find Utnapishtim and learn his secret, maybe immortality is possible for him too. This quest takes him to the edge of the world, through darkness, past monsters, into places where mortals aren't supposed to go. He's trying to escape the cosmic prison by finding a back door, a loophole in the system that created mortality. Along the way, he meets Siduri, a tavern keeper at the edge of the world who gives him advice. Gilgamesh, where are you wandering? The life that you seek you will not find. When the gods created mankind, they established death for mankind and withheld eternal life for themselves. As for you, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full and enjoy yourself day and night. Make every day a feast, dance and play day and night. Let your clothes be clean, let your head be washed, bathe in water. Gaze on the child who holds your hand. Let your wife enjoy your repeated embrace. This is the lot of mankind. This is the wisdom literature perspective articulated clearly. You can't escape death, so find pleasure in life while it lasts. The cosmic prison has no exit, so make your cell as comfortable as possible. But Gilgamesh refuses this advice. He's still seeking the impossible, still believing there must be a way out. He eventually finds Utnapishtim, who tells him the story of the flood, how Enki warned him to build a boat, how he survived when all others died, and how the gods, overcome with remorse, granted him and his wife immortality as special compensation. But Utnapishtim makes clear this was a unique situation, never to be repeated. The gods aren't going to flood the world again and certainly aren't going to grant more mortals eternal life. There's no secret to learn, no repeatable process, no door that Gilgamesh can walk through to escape death. Utnapishtim challenges Gilgamesh to stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights, suggesting that if he can't even conquer sleep, the small death, how can he hope to conquer death itself? Gilgamesh immediately falls asleep and sleeps for 7 days, proving the point. Humans are weak, subject to physical needs, unable to transcend bodily limitations. Immortality requires a divine nature that Gilgamesh, despite being 2/3 god, doesn't possess. As a consolation, Utnapishtim's wife tells Gilgamesh about a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea that can restore youth. It won't grant immortality, but it can turn back aging. Gilgamesh ties stones to his feet and walks along the sea bottom until he finds the plant. He plans to take it back to Uruk and test it on an old man before using it himself. But while bathing in a pool on the journey home, a snake steals the plant and slithers away, shedding its skin as proof of renewed youth. The snake gained what Gilgamesh sought, by accident and theft, highlighting the unfairness of the cosmos and the futility of human planning. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed. He's failed to achieve immortality. He's failed even to restore youth. Everything he sought to escape has caught up with him. But in the final tablet, he seems to find a kind of peace. He shows his companion Ur-Shanabi the walls of Uruk, pointing out their foundation, their construction, their permanence. These walls will outlast Gilgamesh. His name is inscribed on the foundation deposits. Future generations will know he built this. And the story of his deeds is written on tablets, preserved in libraries remembered by scribes. This is the immortality available to mortals, legacy, memory, works that outlast their creators. The epic ends not with triumph but with acceptance. Gilgamesh tried to escape the cosmic prison and failed utterly. Every path he explored led back to the same conclusion. Humans die, period. But in accepting that limitation, he found meaning in what he could accomplish within those limitations. He couldn't beat the system, but he could make his mark on it. He couldn't escape the prison, but he could leave graffiti on the walls that others would read long after he descended to Ker. This is the mature Sumerian wisdom. Recognize reality, accept what can't be changed, find purpose within constraints. It's not optimistic or inspiring in the modern sense. There's no promise that everything works out for the best, no assurance that the universe rewards virtue, or that death is just a transition to something better. The prison is real, it's permanent, and everyone ends up in it regardless of what they do. But within that bleak framework, humans can still build, create, love, remember, and be remembered. Those small victories against oblivion are what make life worthwhile. Part 11. The Fall of Sumerian Civilization when the gods abandon their prison. The Sumerian civilization gradually declined over the course of the second millennium before the Common Era, eventually being absorbed into larger Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian empires. The Sumerian language ceased to be spoken, surviving only as a liturgical and scholarly language used by educated scribes, similar to how Latin survived in medieval Europe. but the cosmology, the myths, the understanding of reality that the Sumerians developed, those persisted and influenced every subsequent culture in Mesopotamia. The decline itself was interpreted through the theological framework we've been discussing. When Ur fell to Elamite invaders around 2004 years before the Common Era, it wasn't seen as political failure or military weakness, it was divine abandonment. The lament for Ur describes Nana the moon god leaving his temple, withdrawing his protection, allowing his city to be destroyed. The goddess Ningal pleads with him to stay, begs the divine assembly to spare the city, but the decree has been made. Ur must fall, its walls must be breached, its temples must be burned, its people must be scattered or killed. The poem doesn't blame the Elamites or suggest better defences could have saved the city. The problem was theological, not military. The gods had determined that Ur's time was over, and nothing humans did could prevent what the gods decreed. This interpretation served multiple purposes. It explained disaster in terms consistent with Sumerian theology. It preserved the idea that the gods were still in control even when things went horribly wrong, and it suggested that future prosperity was possible if the gods could be convinced to return, to once again extend their protection to a rebuilt city. But the gods didn't return in the old way. The Sumerian pantheon was gradually merged with Akkadian deities, their stories retold in Akkadian language, their characteristics blended with Semitic traditions. Inanna became Ishtar, Enki became Ea. The Anunnaki shifted from being a diverse group of gods to being specifically underworld judges. New gods rose to prominence, especially Marduk of Babylon, who in the Enuma Elish was portrayed as defeating chaos and creating the world, taking over roles previously held by Enlil and other Sumerian deities. This theological evolution reflects political changes. As Babylonian power grew, Babylonian gods became more important. The Enuma Elish was composed specifically to legitimize Marduk as king of the gods, justifying Babylon's political supremacy with theological arguments. The older Sumerian creation stories didn't disappear, but they were reinterpreted, retold with Marduk as the hero, or synthesized into a larger mythological complex where Sumerian and Akkadian elements coexisted. Yet the fundamental worldview persisted. Humans were still created to serve gods. Death still led to a dark underworld. Mortality was still unavoidable. The boundary between mortal and divine was still absolute. The cosmic prison maintained its structure even as the names of the jailers changed. Babylonian, Assyrian, and later Persian religious systems all inherited this framework, though they developed it in different directions. The persistence of Sumerian mythological themes throughout later Mesopotamian history shows how deeply these ideas had penetrated the culture. The Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh retained the Sumerian original's fundamental message. Babylonian wisdom literature echoed Sumerian proverbs and pessimism. Assyrian kings claimed divine selection just as Sumerian kings had. The religious calendar, the agricultural rituals, the temple economics, all continued with modifications but remained recognizable as developments from Sumerian precedents. When Persian conquest ended Mesopotamian political independence in the 6th century before the Common Era, even that didn't end the influence of these ideas. Persian religion, Zoroastrianism, developed its own distinct theology with a very different cosmology focused on the conflict between good and evil, light and darkness, truth and the lie. But elements of Mesopotamian thought filtered into Persian culture, especially in the areas that Persia ruled directly. And when Alexander's conquest spread Greek culture across the Near East, Hellenistic philosophy encountered and sometimes adopted Mesopotamian concepts, creating new syntheses. Most significantly, the Hebrew Bible shows extensive influence from Mesopotamian literature and cosmology. The Genesis creation story draws on traditions found in Enuma Elish and earlier Sumerian texts. The flood narrative in Genesis is remarkably similar to the flood story in Gilgamesh and Atrahasis. The concept of humanity's special creation and purpose echoes Sumerian ideas. The Hebrew Sheol, the realm of the dead, shares characteristics with Ker. Jewish apocalyptic literature developed more elaborate afterlife theologies, but the basic structure, a realm beneath the earth where the dead reside, remained consistent. This doesn't mean the Bible is just copied Mesopotamian mythology. Hebrew theology transformed these elements significantly, especially by introducing ethical monotheism, the idea that there's one God who is both all-powerful and morally perfect. This solved the problem of divine capriciousness that plagued Sumerian thought. If there's only one God, and that God is good, then suffering must have moral meaning even if humans can't always understand it. This represented a fundamental break from the Sumerian cosmos, where suffering was often arbitrary. But the influence is undeniable. When later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theology developed concepts of heaven and hell, of resurrection and final judgment, of cosmic justice and eternal reward or punishment, they were building on and reacting against foundations laid by Sumerian cosmology. The Sumerian idea that the cosmos was structured as a hierarchy with absolute boundaries between realms, that humans occupied a specific position in that hierarchy, that death was a transition to another realm where divine beings held power, these core concepts persisted even as the details changed radically. The ultimate irony is that the Sumerian cosmic prison, the idea that reality was structured to keep mortals in their place, serving gods and ending in dusty darkness, was eventually replaced by cosmology's promising escape. Christianity offered resurrection and eternal life in God's presence. Islam promised paradise for the faithful. Even secular modern cosmology, which eliminates gods entirely, offers escape from meaning through naturalistic explanations that reduce human existence to chemical processes without ultimate significance, which is a kind of escape through dissolution of the question itself. But these escapes, whether religious or secular, still operate within frameworks shaped by Sumerian thought. The idea that there are boundaries that need escaping, that mortality is a problem requiring solution, that the human condition is somehow tragic or limited, these assumptions have their roots in Bronze Age Mesopotamia. The Sumerians were the first to articulate systematically the sense that human existence was constrained by forces beyond human control, that we exist in a cosmos not designed for our benefit, that our mortality and limitations are fundamental rather than accidental features of reality. And they did this without gods visiting from other planets, without ancient astronauts or alien genetic engineering, without any of the pseudo-archaeological nonsense that modern conspiracy theorists project onto their texts. They did it with mud bricks and reed styluses, with patient observation of human experience and thoughtful reflection on what it means to be mortal in an apparently indifferent universe. That's actually far more impressive than any alien explanation could be. Part 12. Modern Relevance. The Prison We Still Inhabit. Why does any of this matter 4,000 years later? What relevance do Sumerian tablets have to modern people living in a globalized, technological civilization that bears no resemblance to Bronze Age city-states? The answer is that the fundamental questions the Sumerians grappled with remain our questions. We've developed different answers, different frameworks, different technologies, but the underlying existential situation hasn't changed as much as we might like to think. We're still mortal. Medical science has extended lifespans dramatically, reduced infant mortality, created treatments for diseases that would have been death sentences in ancient times, but we still die. Every human being alive today will die, and as far as we can tell from all available evidence that death is final. There's no scientifically verified afterlife, no confirmed cases of resurrection or reincarnation that stand up to rigorous scrutiny. The prison of mortality that concerned the Sumerians still confines us, despite all our technology. We still grapple with meaning in the face of death. Modern secular culture sometimes pretends death isn't a big deal, or develops coping mechanisms like talking about living on in memories or through one's children or work. Sound familiar? That's exactly what the Sumerians concluded 4,500 years ago. We've come full circle, back to seeking immortality through legacy and memory, because physical immortality remains impossible. Or alternatively, modern people seek meaning through religious frameworks promising eternal life, which is a rejection of the Sumerian conclusion, but one that acknowledges the same problem. We still exist in hierarchical structures not entirely of our making. The Sumerians served gods and kings. We serve markets, governments, social systems, economic necessities. We have more mobility than they did, more ability to change our circumstances, but we're still embedded in structures that constrain our choices and often seem indifferent to our individual welfare. A Sumerian farmer tilling a temple field and a modern employee working in a corporate office are not equivalent, but both exist within systems that demand their labor, reward some and punish others according to rules they didn't create, and continue functioning regardless of individual satisfaction or suffering. The Sumerian awareness that power doesn't correlate with moral worth remains relevant. They knew their gods were powerful but not necessarily good. That might didn't make right even though it determined outcomes. We face similar realization constantly. Wealth, political power, social influence, none of these correspond reliably to virtue or wisdom. Bad people prosper, good people suffer. The system rewards some behaviors and punishes others, but not in ways that align neatly with justice. The Sumerians developed wisdom literature to help navigate this reality. We developed self-help books, political philosophy, and coping mechanisms serving similar functions. The question of what we owe to forces beyond our control also persists. The Sumerians offered sacrifice to gods. We pay taxes to governments, generate value for shareholders, perform emotional labor for family and friends, contribute to social cohesion through various means. We conceptualize these obligations differently, but the basic structure remains. Individuals exist within webs of obligation that they can't simply opt out of without consequences. Some of those obligations are legitimate, some are exploitative, some are somewhere in between. Just as Sumerian temple service was simultaneously religious devotion, economic system, social welfare program, and extraction of surplus labor. The fear of being forgotten after death, leaving no lasting impact, this remains deeply human. Social media, legacy projects, the desire for children or students or mentees who will remember us, our concern with reputation and honor, all of this echoes Sumerian obsession with having their names recorded and spoken. We build different kinds of monuments than ziggurats, but we're still building monuments, still trying to leave marks that outlast our physical existence, still hoping that memory provides a kind of continuity beyond death. The Sumerian response to existential dread: accept what can't be changed, find meaning within constraints, do good work, maintain relationships, seek pleasure where you can, leave something behind. This remains perhaps the most practical approach to human existence. All the religious and philosophical systems that developed afterward either elaborate on this basic wisdom or try to escape it through various metaphysical promises. But the Sumerian baseline, acceptance of mortality combined with determination to make the limited time available meaningful, that's still the foundation most people operate from, whether they acknowledge it or not. Even the specific cosmic prison metaphor has modern relevance. We exist on a planet we can't leave in any meaningful numbers. We're bound by physical laws we didn't design and can't violate. We have biological needs: food, water, air, shelter that create vulnerabilities and dependencies. We're mortal through processes we barely understand and certainly can't stop. These are boundaries as absolute as the boundaries between heaven, earth, and Ker. We've explored some of these boundaries more thoroughly than the Sumerians could, but we haven't transcended them. Climate change, resource depletion, nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence risks, pandemics, these modern concerns all reflect awareness that we exist in a delicately balanced system where human action has consequences, where the gods, or in our case, physical and biological realities, might withdraw their favor if we transgress too far. The Sumerian fear that divine anger could lead to city destruction translates to modern fear that ecosystem collapse or technological catastrophe could end civilization. The mechanism is different, but the awareness of existential vulnerability is the same. The Sumerian solution to cosmic constraints builds strong communities, maintain infrastructure, pass on knowledge to the next generation, develop wisdom traditions that help people cope with suffering, find beauty and meaning in cultural production. These remain our solutions. We do these things with different technologies and in different contexts, but we're still fundamentally trying to make life livable within boundaries we can't fully escape. still trying to maintain human flourishing despite mortality and limitation. In a deep sense, we still inhabit a version of the cosmic prison the Sumerians described, not because their specific theology was correct, but because they accurately identified aspects of the human condition that technology hasn't eliminated. We're more comfortable in our prison than they were in theirs. We've decorated the walls, installed better plumbing, developed entertainment systems that distract from the bars. But we're still mortal beings with limited power living in a cosmos that doesn't seem designed for our benefit, seeking meaning and connection before inevitable death claims us. The authentic Sumerian tablets, properly translated and understood in context, speak to this enduring human situation more powerfully than any ancient astronaut fantasy ever could. They show people 4,000 years ago grappling honestly with questions that still keep us awake at night, developing answers that sometimes comfort and sometimes disturb, creating culture and meaning despite recognizing that dust and darkness await everyone. That's the real legacy of Sumerian civilization, preserved on tablets that survived when everything else, the cities, the temples, the political structures, even the language crumbled to ruins. Understanding what the Sumerians actually believed, what they actually wrote, what they actually experienced, this connects us to them in ways that pseudo-archaeological inventions never could. We share their mortality, their limitations, their need for meaning. We're all prisoners in the same cosmic structure, trying to make the best of our brief lives before the final gate opens and we pass through into whatever comes after. The Sumerians had their answer to what comes after. Kur, dust and darkness. We have different answers, or we suspend judgment, or we hope they were wrong, but we're asking their question, living their reality, seeking solutions to their problem. That's why the tablets matter, not because they contain secret knowledge or alien revelations, but because they contain human truth, articulated with remarkable honesty by people who looked at mortality and servitude and cosmic boundaries and refused to flinch, who built a civilization anyway, who found meaning within their constraints, and who wrote it all down on clay tablets that would outlast bronze, outlast stone, outlast everything but the human need to understand where we came from and where we're going. Conclusion. Tonight we've journeyed through the authentic Sumerian cosmology, examining what the tablets actually say about creation, servitude, death, and the underworld. We've seen how the concept of a cosmic prison makes sense in Sumerian thought without needing to invoke extraterrestrials, how Kur functioned as an inescapable realm of the dead, how humans were explicitly created to serve gods, how boundaries between realms were carefully maintained, and how the Sumerians developed wisdom traditions to help them accept and navigate these constraints. We've also seen how modern pseudo-archaeology has distorted these authentic beliefs, how Ziskria Sitchin and his successors have misrepresented Sumerian texts to support ancient astronaut theories that have no basis in the actual tablets. We've examined the evidence, the cylinder seals, the astronomical texts, the creation myths, the underworld descriptions, and shown that real Sumerian cosmology is far stranger and more interesting than the science fiction versions popular culture has created. The planet-sized prison described by Sumerian tablets isn't a physical planet or an alien construction. It's the cosmos itself, structured to maintain boundaries between mortal and divine, between living and dead, between Earth and the realms above and below. It's a reality where humans exist to serve purposes not their own, where mortality is inescapable, where the afterlife offers no reward, where the gods are powerful but not benevolent. It's a harsh vision of existence, but one that the Sumerians faced with remarkable courage, building a civilization that lasted over 1,000 years, creating literature that still speaks to us, developing insights about human nature that remain relevant today. In understanding what the Sumerians actually believed, we learn not just about them, but about ourselves. We see our own struggles with mortality reflected in their myths. We recognize our own questions about meaning in their wisdom literature. We understand our own constraints mirrored in their cosmic structure. The prison they describe still holds us, though we've redecorated and renamed it, though we've developed new coping mechanisms and new escape fantasies, but we're still mortal, still limited, still seeking meaning in a cosmos that seems indifferent to our existence. The Sumerian tablets don't offer easy answers or comforting promises. They offer something more valuable, honest assessment of the human condition from people who lived it fully, who built grandly despite knowing that death would claim them, who created beauty knowing it would fade, who wrote words knowing that languages die, their civilization fell, their cities crumbled, their language was forgotten for millennia. But their words survived, pressed into clay and baked by catastrophe into permanence, waiting to tell us that we're not alone in our struggles, that humans have always confronted these same questions, that meaning can be found even in a cosmic prison with no exit. So the next time you encounter claims about ancient aliens or hidden knowledge in Sumerian tablets, remember, the truth is available, written in a language we can read, preserved in museums and archives around the world, translated by scholars who spent their lives learning dead languages. The authentic Sumerian worldview needs no embellishment. It's profound enough, disturbing enough, relevant enough on its own terms. They were trying to understand their place in the cosmos just as we are. They were grappling with mortality just as we do. They were seeking purpose within constraints just as we must. The prison they described is the prison we inhabit, not because we're slaves to alien overlords, but because we're mortal beings in an ancient pattern seeking meaning before darkness claims us, building monuments that will outlast our bodies if not our memories, hoping that in some small way we matter, that we'll be remembered, that the brief light of consciousness we experience isn't entirely meaningless. That's the message from the dust of Sumer, written 4,000 years ago and still echoing today, still true, still ours. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time and text. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what the Sumerian tablets really say, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Sumerian cosmology do you find most relevant to modern life? How do you think we should interpret ancient texts compared to what popular culture often claims about them? I love reading your perspectives on these deep historical topics. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that the truth is often stranger and more meaningful than the myths we create about it. Epilogue: The Enduring Legacy of Cuneiform Thought. Before we close, it's worth reflecting on how the Sumerian intellectual achievement, particularly their systematic recording of human thought on clay tablets, shaped everything that came after. When the Sumerians invented writing around 3,200 years before the Common Era, they did more than create a tool for accounting and record keeping. They created a technology for preserving thought across time, for speaking to the future, for building accumulated knowledge that could grow beyond what any individual could remember. The earliest tablets are simple, lists of goods, counts of animals, records of transactions, but within a few centuries scribes were using the same writing system to record prayers, myths, laws, contracts, medical treatments, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, and philosophical reflections. The technology of writing made possible the accumulation of culture, the preservation of wisdom, the transmission of complex ideas across generations. Without writing, each generation would start from zero, relying on memory and oral tradition. With writing, each generation could build on what came before, creating the exponential growth of knowledge that eventually led to science, philosophy, and all the other achievements of literate civilization. The tablets themselves are objects of remarkable durability. Clay is cheap, abundant, and once baked, incredibly long-lasting. Parchment rots, paper burns, papyrus crumbles, but clay tablets, if kept dry or even if buried in the right conditions, survive millennia. The catastrophic fires that destroyed Sumerian cities actually helped preserve tablets by baking them hard. Libraries that would have been lost if written on any other medium became archaeological treasures because they were written on clay. This accident of material choice means we have better documentation of Bronze Age Mesopotamia than of much more recent civilizations that used more perishable writing materials. The scribes who created these tablets were professionals, part of a literate elite that maintained complex knowledge systems. Training to be a scribe took years, starting in childhood, involving rote memorization of hundreds of cuneiform signs, practice in mathematics and accounting, study of traditional literature, and mastery of both Sumerian and Akkadian for bilingual scribes in later periods. These scribes preserved the texts we've been discussing, copying and recopying them across centuries, adding commentaries, adapting them to new contexts, ensuring their survival. But they were also human, and the tablets sometimes reveal their humanity in touching ways. Student exercises show mistakes and corrections, revealing the learning process. Scribal colophons sometimes include complaints about difficult working conditions, requests for divine blessing, or notes about being tired or hungry while copying. One scribe added to the end of a long text, "The hand is tired." Another wrote, "Whoever picks up this tablet, may Nabu, scribe of the gods, bless him." These small personal touches remind us that behind all the theology and cosmology and royal propaganda were individual people, scribes who spent their days pressing wedges into clay, preserving the thoughts of their culture for a future they could barely imagine. The preservation of these tablets through archaeological recovery, beginning in the 19th century, has given modern scholarship access to voices from the deep past. We can read the actual words of people who lived 40 centuries ago, not mediated through later traditions, or transmitted through chains of copying that might introduce errors and changes. The tablets are primary sources, direct witnesses to what people believed and thought and recorded as important. This makes them invaluable for understanding not just Sumerian civilization, but human civilization generally, how it develops, what patterns recur, what questions keep arising regardless of technological level or cultural context. And yet, despite having these incredible sources available, despite the work of generations of scholars who learned to read cuneiform and published translations and spent their careers analyzing these texts, we still see widespread belief in pseudo-archaeological interpretations that ignore or distort what the tablets actually say. This suggests something about human psychology, about our relationship with the past, about the stories we want to be true versus the stories that are true. People want to believe that ancient civilizations had secret knowledge, that mainstream archaeology is hiding important discoveries, that there are simple explanations for historical mysteries that experts are too closed-minded to accept. This desire is understandable. It makes the past more exciting, suggests that reality is more interesting than the conventional narrative, and empowers non-experts by suggesting that anyone can make important discoveries if they just think outside the box. But it also does real harm by devaluing expertise, spreading misinformation, and obscuring the actual, genuinely fascinating truths that careful scholarship has uncovered. The real story of Sumerian civilization is more interesting than the ancient astronaut version. The fact that humans, starting from basically nothing, invented agriculture, developed cities, created writing, built monuments, compiled laws, composed literature, made astronomical observations, performed surgery, calculated with base 60 mathematics, and contemplated the meaning of existence, all without any outside help. This is amazing. The fact that they did this while developing a coherent if bleak cosmology, while grappling with mortality and meaning, while creating beauty despite knowing that death would claim them, this demonstrates human resilience and creativity in ways that attributing everything to aliens completely undermines. When we claim that ancient people couldn't have achieved what they achieved without extraterrestrial intervention, we're insulting them. We're saying they weren't smart enough or capable enough to build their own civilization. We're erasing their agency, their intelligence, their accomplishments. The Sumerians were brilliant. They invented things we still use. Their literature still moves us. Their observations about human nature still ring true. They deserve credit for what they achieved, not to have their achievements attributed to imaginary alien visitors. The tablets are there, waiting to be read. The dictionaries exist. The translations are published. Anyone sufficiently interested can learn cuneiform, can check the claims that pseudo-archaeologists make, can verify what the texts actually say. The evidence is transparent and available. When scholars say that Sitchin mistranslated words, they're not gatekeeping or protecting secrets. They're pointing out verifiable facts that anyone with the relevant training can confirm. This is how knowledge works in an open society. Claims are made, evidence is provided, others check the evidence. Consensus emerges around what the evidence actually shows. The Sumerian tablets describing a cosmic prison are real. That prison is Kur, the underworld, combined with the theological understanding that humans exist to serve gods and are bound by mortality. It's a metaphysical prison built into the structure of reality as the Sumerians understood it. It's not a physical planet, not an alien construction, not a hidden truth that mainstream archaeology suppresses. It's the ancient Mesopotamian worldview, honestly expressed, carefully recorded, and available to anyone willing to read what the tablets actually say rather than what they wish the tablets said. In the end, approaching ancient texts with respect means taking them seriously on their own terms. It means learning the languages they were written in, understanding the cultural context that produced them, acknowledging the humanity of the people who wrote them, and being willing to let them speak for themselves rather than ventriloquizing them and to support modern agendas. The Sumerians have something to teach us, but only if we listen to what they actually said rather than what we imagine they must have meant. The cosmic prison they described wasn't external, it was existential. It was the human condition itself. Mortality, limitation, dependency, the need for meaning in a cosmos that offers no guarantees. We still live in that prison. We've remodeled it, renamed it, developed new coping strategies, but the fundamental situation remains unchanged. We're mortal beings seeking purpose, building civilizations that will outlast us but not forever, hoping to be remembered, trying to matter. That was true in Sumer 4,000 years ago. It's true now. It will be true for as long as humans exist. The tablets preserve that truth, pressed into clay by people who understood it deeply, who built beautiful cities anyway, who created art and literature anyway, who loved and hoped and feared anyway, who lived fully despite knowing that Kur awaited them. Their courage, their creativity, their refusal to give up on meaning despite facing cosmic indifference, that's the real message from the tablets. That's the legacy worth honoring. That's the truth worth preserving and passing on.